Eden Memorial Chapels understands Jewish funerals can take many forms. Some are very Orthodox, while others are more conservative or of a Reformed nature. There's no one better in New York or New Jersey. Go to EdenMemorial.com.
It's More Money with leading economist Steve Moore.
Stephen Moore is with us, economist.
With more than 30 years experience as an economist and as a leading thinker of government on business, showing deep understanding of the shifts in the global economy. He's leading economist Steve Moore with More Money on Talk Radio 77 WABC. Now, here's your host, Steve Moore.
Welcome back, folks. This is the More Money Show. By the way, I will be taking you. We're live. We're in color. If you dial, don't change the dial. But if you did, you just hear boring infomercials almost every other channel. We're live. We have the best guests in the country, and one of them is coming up right now, and that is David Stockman, who's somebody I've admired for 40 years. He was one of the original Reaganites at the start of the Reagan Revolution. Had worked for Jack Kemp. Was Reagan's budget director, put out some of the best budgets ever, made a great play at cutting our budget. Sometimes he didn't win those fights. A lot of times he didn't. But now he is, I call him the Pied Piper of fiscal sanity in America, and that's David Stockman. David, thanks so much for joining.
Great to be with you, Steve. And it's true, back in 1981 when we took a real run at shrinking the budget for the first time really in decades, I mention this because the problem we inherited from Jimmy Carter was a $1 trillion public debt. It was 31% of GDP. We're about ready finally to get rid of Biden, and the number is going to be $36 trillion and 125% of GDP.
Oh, my God.
We are kind of graying in the years, but we haven't been around that long. That's 44 years. And we've had this massive increase in the public debt, not just the number, but the burden on the GDP. So I think that's the core issue that somehow the government has to address, and neither candidate, unfortunately, is doing it. That's the problem.
So before we get further into the debt issue, and that's why I wanted to bring you on, but we Reaganites, and I worked for Reagan at the very end of his presidency. You were there at the beginning, but we're dying off. That was a long time ago, and I just wonder, you were in the Oval Office many times with Ronald Reagan. What are some of your memories of the Gipper, and what kind of a president was he?
Well, first of all, he was the most economically literate, knowledgeable, historically educated president we've had in modern times.
Wow.
He actually knew what happened in the 1920s and the 1930s and the post-war period, and could cite, economists that most politicians never heard of.
But wait a minute, David, do you remember back when he was running? Remember they said he's just a grade B actor. He doesn't know anything about policy. Remember that?
Yeah, I know. They said that he can read a script, but that wasn't true. He really understood. And so therefore, one of the great things that happened during his administration was we inherited double-digit inflation. Interest rates were 16, 17%.
Right. I remember.
On the 10-year, 20. People can't believe that nowadays. 20% on the prime rate. And Volcker did a tremendously courageous thing when he said, this can't stand. He really threw on the brakes. The economy did suffer pretty badly in 81 and 82. And my point is, although even Republican politicians at the time said, this has got to stop. You've got to, attack Volcker, and we can't live with this. And Reagan said, no. We inherited double-digit inflation. It was because of too much money printing, too much deficit. I'll work on the deficit. Let Volcker work on the money printing. And sure enough, by early 83, the inflation rate was down to 2.5%, 3%.
I know.
The economy, the economy got up off its hind legs and took off. And we had a prosperity spurt, for the mid-'80s and through the end of the decade, like we haven't had since. So if it hadn't been for his historical knowledge and his real philosophical commitment to sound money, I'm sure the typical Republican president, say Bush had been elected then, they would have been all over Volcker, and I don't know if they ever would have gotten inflation tamed.
I agree with you. I thought Paul Volcker and Reagan broke the back of inflation, which was one of the greatest, economic achievements, and I couldn't agree more. And I was, in high school, I think when we had those high inflation rates. But boy, I remember it. I mean, literally every time you'd go to the I don't know if I ever told you the story, but I was working as a grocery store clerk, and I have to keep coming in and put stickers of higher prices on every week because the inflation was so high.
Exactly. At the time, Steve, before I went into the Reagan administration, I was a congressman from Michigan, and I was home every week, and this is at a time when mortgage rates were in the mid-teens. When grocery prices were rising at 12, 13, 15% annual rates. And boy, people let you know that they couldn't live with that and that Washington needed to really, change directions dramatically. So the system will respond if things get bad enough. Unfortunately, right now, we're kind of drifting along and stumbling along. We did get rid of the 9% inflation. It's still 3 to 4%, still way too high. But the Fed starts another rate cutting cycle when we haven't even beat the inflation from last time. And so it's not only that, but I think there's an important thing people need to understand. The reason we have these tremendous deficits, and, we just finished the year, the numbers were out a couple of days ago, $1.8 trillion at a time, new debt, at a time when allegedly we were at full employment. Now, that was, 6.5% of GDP, a deficit that big at full employment. It's only going to get bigger as we go forward. In fact, we could get into some of those numbers. They're terrible. But the point is, if the Fed had not printed so much money over the last 2 decades, we wouldn't have had deficits of this magnitude because interest rates would have been pushed up. It would have been a signal to politicians. They would have heard a lot of very anguished cries from back home to stop this. This is how it used to work. But once the Fed went into what, we call the monetization business, monetizing the debt, the politicians didn't hear from the bond vigilantes, so to speak.
So, David, your book, your book that you wrote, which I've always said is every single political science major in every university should read, which was the first book that you wrote, which is, of course, called about your Reagan years, and it's called The Triumph of Politics, a fantastic, fantastic book. You talk about, I remember reading that when I was about 23 years old, and I was just, my eyes just burst open. We think that Republicans want to cut spending, and that it's these big liberal Democrats. Now, the big liberal Democrats do like to spend money. But what I learned from your book is that Republicans like to spend money, too.
Yeah, that was the problem. We were trying to say, look, food stamps are out of control. We have got to sharply curtail and tighten eligibility and all the other things we did because we can't spend that kind of money. But also, why do we have the Export-Import Bank? All the money's going to General Electric and Boeing. Giant companies with huge market caps. They should be able to fund their own export sales. But when push came to shove, they didn't want to cut Export-Import Bank. I'm talking about Republicans now. And then we got to farm subsidies, and we said, we believe in free markets. Let the price of wheat find its natural level in the world market and so forth. They didn't want to cut the farm subsidies, and they didn't want to cut a lot of the pork barrel projects going back home for rivers and harbors and, all the rest of it. So, and then the other thing, unfortunately, and there's a lot of disagreement in the Republican Party, but the defense budget just took off. Jimmy Carter's budget was $140 billion, was $350 billion by the time Reagan finished. And we spent so much on defense that everything that we saved on the domestic side got reallocated to defense. And pretty soon you couldn't find a corporal's guard of Republicans in the House, even some of the stout anti-spenders who were willing to walk the plank because they said, well, it's just going to that big pork barrel in DOD, and what's the point? So that's the problem we have today too. It's a big problem today.
I'm talking to David Stockman, who was Ronald Reagan's first budget director, put together probably one of the great budget proposals of all time. And I'm thinking, here we are more than 40 years after you put those budgets together, about cutting, hundreds and hundreds of wasteful programs. You mentioned the Export-Import Bank, a lot of the farm subsidies, or Legal Services Corporation, money to the Corporation for Public Broadcast. I mean, and you know what's so disheartening, David, is here we are 40 years later, and those programs have the bigger budgets than ever before.
Exactly right. In fact, even some of them that we managed to curtail, like subsidies for the arts and humanities, even those have grown back to where they were, and then some. I'm talking about even adjusted for inflation. So it's a serious problem. But I think people always have to remember that if we don't have a central bank making it too easy for the politicians. Right. By monetizing the debt, if we let the free market push interest rates, to a market clearing level, these politicians would wake up. Back in 1981, 82, a lot of the Republican mainstream senators, we called them, as you might remember, the old Bulls or the College of Cardinals, they believed in tax cuts, but they were afraid it would cause too big a deficit, and they were about as anti-deficit as they come. That was then. But today, you can't find a Corporal's Guard or Republicans that want to do much deficit cutting either.
No, they won't. They just, the Republicans just passed, a continuing resolution to just, kick the can into the next year. And so what do we do, David? You and I have been fiscal warriors for years and years and years, and we're running bigger deficits than ever before. And I don't know when are we going to Reagan used to say that the, closest thing to immortality on this earth is a federal government program. Yeah. And I think he's been kind of proven correct about that. But what is the strategy? How do we do it? How do we did balance the budget at the end of the Clinton administration, but since then, runaway deficits.
Yeah. Well, I would, obviously you can't give up the ghost, you can't give up the fight, but also I think we have to do much better job of demonstrating to people that reform, ironically, has to start at the Federal Reserve. Until we get the Federal Reserve out of the bond market, out of, these massive purchases of government debt, week after week, month after month, we're not going to be able to sober up the politicians politically. And I know that if they have to finance the deficit honestly in the bond market, drive up interest rates, hurt homeowners, mortgage borrowers back home, or small businesses, the political system finds countervailing forces against spending and against borrowing. So, ironically, the route to sobriety fiscally and stopping this, death spiral that we're in will be root and branch reform at the Federal Reserve. And, maybe that's the next chapter that we really need to work on. So
you're a little more apocalyptic about the debt than I am, but we're both extremely concerned about it. So if we don't do something about this, I don't see how this story can have a happy ending. What will happen if we continue to if you look at the Biden baseline, they want to borrow $2 trillion a year from now until forever.
Yes, that's an important point. Right now, we're stuck in a fiscal policy that says, well, we'll take about 18% of GDP in taxes, but we're going to spend 25% of GDP or more. That's a 7% gap, but it's not stable, because what we learned this year is that if you have to have even quasi-normal interest rates, which we've been having now for the last year and a half, interest on the public debt is going to soar. We had interest in the year just ended of $1.1 trillion, which was 23% of every dollar of revenue that came in went to paying interest on the debt. So we're in danger of what, is called a debt interest spiral, because if we don't do something about this gap, the 7%, 25 spending, 18 revenue, it's just going to soar. Now, I can give you a number that just tells you how crazy this is, but we're heading under existing policy, if nothing changes, same revenue, same spending.
Yep.
We're heading to 150 trillion public debt by mid-century.
That's insanity.
That's 1.5 times the GDP of the entire planet Earth. Okay, if you want a big number. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's going to crash. I mean, we cannot continue to do what you're doing. I'm so we're fortunate that we have someone like you educating us about the dangers that lie ahead. David Stockman. David, by the way, what's your latest book?
The latest book that I wrote was it's called Trump's War on Capitalism, and it's basically trying to show that even under Donald Trump and the Republicans, they did nothing about really reducing the fiscal situation that's out of control, as well as the whole regulatory apparatus on the economy. They talked about regulation, but they didn't do much. So if we don't get, the fiscal burden off the economy and the regulatory burden off the economy, we're not going to get the kind of growth we need to even keep up with what CBO is now forecasting. Anyway,
well, that's Dave.
But I write about this, Steve, every day in a newsletter I put out called David Stockman's Contra Corner.
How do people get that?
You can just Google it. You'll find it.
David Stockman. Okay. It's good stuff, David. We go on a hard break. So thankful and appreciative that you take some time off on a Saturday afternoon to educate us about the fiscal crisis that we're in. I think everybody knows it. It's a question of whether we're going to grow up and do something about it. And thank goodness we have warriors like you. Folks, this is the More Money Show. We'll be right back.
The following is a paid political announcement.
This November, down-ballot victories are more important than in any past election. Presenting the Get Out and Vote Republican campaign. The purpose is to reach local conservative and Republican voters, to drive them to vote and to vote down ballot on party lines. Get out and vote in this crucial election year. Vote down ballot on party lines. Get out and vote Republican.
I'm Mike Sapricone, candidate for U.S. Senate, and I approve this message.
Paid for by Sapricone for Senate.